In this lesson, we'll explore using animations in React Router for a better user experience. Alright, we will use React Transition Group to achieve this. You can use other libraries like Framer Motion or any other one you want as well. I chose React Transition Group simply because it's easy and uses pure CSS for its animation. So everyone should be able to follow along. Alright, let's install React Transition Group in our project. Now let's head to our terminal and terminate the process. And then we do npm install React Transition Group. Just like this. We hit enter and allow that to install. Alright, once that's done installing, let's do npm start again. So we have our project running throughout. Sorry for the noise in the background. Apparently my neighbor is having a construction. Alright, we have our project back up and running. Now let's head back to our app.js file, and we need to import two components from React Transition Group. We need the switch transition component. So let's import switch transition component. The switch transition component basically acts as a wrapper for all elements or routes in this case that will inherit from the transition animation. The other component we need from React Transition is CSS transition. So we say CSS transition. As you can see, we have a suggestion here. So these are the two transition components we need from React Transition to achieve our goal. All right. So in order for this to work, we need to nest our entire route component inside of our switch transition and CSS transition components. So let's define them up here. So we say switch transition. And then inside of it, we also create the CSS transition tag, just like this. Then we cut our entire route components and everything inside of it. And then we paste it inside our CSS transition component, just like this. So what we just did is we basically just wrapped our entire routes inside of switch transition and CSS transition components. All right. But before this can work, we need to define the animation effect we want during the transition, the time it should take, and a value that tracks our navigation, so the animation can always trigger when the route changes. I hope that makes sense. Let's actually see how that works in code to give you a better understanding. So back in our app.css file, let's define the animation we want for our transition. We are going to add a fade animation, so just code along with me. So we say .fade. So we say .fade enter. So this is the animation that will start. So we want the opacity to be 0. And then we also want .fade enter active. This is the animation that will happen during the transition. So here we set the opacity, not object fit, opacity back to 1. And let's define a transition. Let's define a transition group of opacity. We want 300 seconds, 300 milliseconds, and then we want the ease in effect. All right. So this is the animation that will happen during the transition, and this is the one that will happen when the transition begins. I hope that makes sense. Then next, we also need a fade exit. As the name implies, the animation that will happen whenever the transition is about to exit. So we still want the opacity here to be 1. And then lastly, we want the fade exit active. So this is the last effect that will happen in the transition. And here we want the opacity back to 0. And then the transition group of opacity. We want 300 milliseconds again, and then ease out. I think this is pretty straightforward. This is the animation that will trigger when the transition starts. This is the animation that will trigger during the transition, and this is the animation that will trigger when the transition is exiting. And then finally, we have the animation that will trigger at the end of our transition. I hope that makes sense. Now that we've defined our CSS transition, let's head back to our app.js and make use of it. Inside of our transition component, we are going to give it a class name of fade. Now the fade class name we've given to the CSS transition will be able to track all the animations we defined in our app.css. Please don't also forget to import your app.css in your app.js file. If not, this will not work. All right. Now that we've defined our animation, there are also a few things we need to do in order for this to work. Now let's add the timeout prop. So we say timeout. We want this to run under 300 milliseconds, just as we defined in our CSS over here. We set our transition property to run under 300 milliseconds. And I think that makes sense to also define the same inside of our timeout prop. So in here, we're just going to say 300. And then also, we want to unmount our animation when it's done. So we just add an unmount prop over here. Unmount on exit. This basically is going to remove our animation when it's done running. So that means whenever this class is activated and done running, we are going to unmount the animation so the user can view the page. All right. Now we've defined our animation and its timeout and what happens when it's done running. But we also need a way for our CSS transition component to track our navigations. So it actually triggers whenever a user actually navigates. And React Router offers a use location hook that does exactly that. So let's import use location from React Router DOM. Up here, where we imported other React Router components and hooks, we can just add it over here. Say use location, just like that. Now let's initiate it into a variable. So we say const location is equal to use location, just like this. So still inside our CSS transition component, let's add our location to its key prop. So we say key is equal to location. So we say key is equal to location. So we want the path name from our location hook. So we say location.pathname. All right. I hope that makes sense. So the last thing we need to do is actually pass our location hook to our route, so it changes the location variable whenever the user navigates. And that is how the CSS transition is going to be able to track our location and actually implement our transition. So inside of our route component, we are just going to add the location prop. So we say location is equal to location. As simple as this. Now, whenever the route changes, the route component is going to change our location value, which is going to be detected by our CSS transition, and then the animation is going to activate. I hope that makes sense. And then before we head over to our browser, inside our switch transition component at the head level, we give it a component prop. And this usually takes a component in the case where you have like a wrapper component that has custom CSS. But since we don't have a base wrapper component, we are just going to give it a value of null. All right. Now let's finally head back to our browser and test this out. Let's refresh the page. And then let's click on one of the links from the navbar. If I click on the user's link, you can see the navbar animates. But if you look at our main component, it doesn't animate upon transition. Let's go back to the user's page. Pay closer attention and see. See, the navbar animates and then the component changes abruptly. That is not what we want. We want the entire page to animate, not just the navbar. So what's the problem? So this is a problem with nested routes. As you can see, we nested all of our routes inside of our navbar route here. The easiest solution to this is to unnest our routes and find a better way to display our navbar. Now, since we want the navbar in all of our pages, we can head to our index.js file where we have our browser router component wrapping our app component, and we can simply add our nav component above it. So in here, we can have our navbar component just like this. This will do the exact same thing we wanted when we nested the component inside of our nav component. Now, with this, we can unnest our component. So let's actually delete our nav route. Just like this. And with this, we have unnested our components. All of our components now sit right inside of our route component. And this nav component will now be able to track all of our navigations since all other routes are directly under it. As weird as this might seem, this is the convention. And it really does offer a more robust way to display our navbar. Let's actually head back to our browser and see if this works. Now back in our browser, if I refresh, You see, we still have our nav exactly the way it used to be before we unnested the component. Now let's click on one of these links from our navbar and see if everything animates. If I click on users, you see we have a smooth animation all over our page. If I click on login, we have animation. Let's actually test our login. And if we log in, we still have our animation being displayed for us. If we head back to our home page, you see our animation works perfectly the way we want it to. It's okay if this lesson was confusing or overwhelming for you. We just need more practice to grasp these concepts, as with everything in this industry. And that practice, you are going to get enough of it as we build more projects in the later parts of this course.